I welcome all of you to the Care for Rare webinar series. And Organization of Rare Disease India is very happy to present our today's speaker, Dr. Ali Smyth. Uh, Organization of Rare Disease India is an NGO which has been working for diagnosis, awareness, treatment, and also for patient support in this particular field of rare disease. Uh, Under the very able leadership of Mr. Prasanna Sarol, and today we have a very important topic, which is very, very important as far as rare disease is concerned, which is rare disease clinical research. And we have Dr. Ali Smyth with us. Dr. Ali Smyth is the Strategy Director, Pediatric and Rare Center of Excellence of IQVIA. She supports rare disease programs across IQVIA and also drives collaborations with rare disease patients and families to bring their voices into the clinical studies and programs. Dr. Smyth has worked in rare disease and oncology for 12 years in a variety of roles in the patient and site engagement, medical and scientific communications, investor relations, and clinical development planning. Surely we would definitely benefit a bit from her lecture today. And before she starts, I would request all of you to please be on mute and post your questions at the end of the session. Over to you, Dr. Ali Smyth.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Datta. And I just wanted to say hi to everyone with my video on. I will stop my video now to ensure that the presentation runs smoothly. I'm sure we've all had challenges with video conferencing during this time. To the Organisation for Rare Disease for inviting me to give this webinar. So as Dr. Datta mentioned, I work in IQVIA's Pediatric and Rare Disease Centre of Excellence, and I work mainly with the parts of IQVIA that are running clinical research studies in pediatrics and rare disease on behalf of pharmaceutical and biotech companies to find new treatments for pediatric and rare disease illnesses. In the Pediatric and Rare Disease Centre of Excellence, we're a multidisciplinary group of medics and scientists, and our background is from academia, from industry, from hospitals, from regulators, biotech companies. But we come together as individuals really to support pediatric and rare disease clinical trials across IQVIA, regardless of the therapy area that they're in, sharing best practice, training, lessons learned across the whole portfolio. And I guess you could ask why a group like ours are needed and why rare disease clinical research needs a completely different approach often to more prevalent indications. So before I dive into the details on that, I just wanted to share this slide. I'm sure everybody's familiar with roughly what constitutes a rare disease. There are different definitions, all roughly equate to a very similar ballpark. So if we take the EU definition of less than 5 per 10,000 people, the US definition works out to approximately less than 6 per 10,000, and Japan's definition works out at less than 4 patients per 10,000 people in the population. And so when we think about that in terms of more prevalent conditions, type 2 diabetes affects around 1 in 10 individuals in the US. In India, the number's much lower in rural areas, although similar in urban areas, certainly similar in other countries also. So compared to the top end spectrum, or the cutoff for rare disease, so the least rare diseases will be 4, 5 or 6 patients in 10,000 people, whereas diabetes will be 1,000 patients out of 10,000 people. And I really wanted to illustrate here, this is absolutely the upper end of the cutoff. We have another classification for what we call ultra rare diseases, where 1 in less than 50,000 individuals are impacted. But certainly a lot of the rare diseases, we see prevalences in the order of 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million. Sometimes there are only 60 or 6 individuals that have ever been known globally. And so why does this present such a challenge? Well, if we start with the patients and families, this absolutely produces huge challenges just for them to be able to manage their condition or obtain diagnosis in the first place, to be able to access medical care and to be able to access resources that may help with their condition. So again, if we take this example of type 2 diabetes, when a patient presents with their primary physician, not only is their primary physician well aware, knows what symptoms to expect, but will have treated many patients with that condition. We'll have family members, colleagues, co-workers, neighbours who have been impacted by that condition. We'll have heard a lot about that condition throughout training in medical school, and then in frequent management of those patients, either direct management or continuing care while they're under the care of a specialist. So that primary physician will already be aware of the different treatment options that are available, how those are applicable to different demographic groups under that disease, what referral pathways for specialists are appropriate, how to advise the family on presentations in the emergency room or for acute presentations, for example. And so you can see that for a very common indication, just the fact that there are that many people around you in the community who would have that condition too, it completely changes the amount of information and support that you're able to receive. And in rare disease, certainly in rare and ultra rare disease, patients will typically have a very long path to diagnosis, visiting with multiple specialists. When they do receive a diagnosis, there aren't necessarily treatment options available. Sometimes there may be symptomatic treatment options. Very rarely are there disease-modifying treatments available. And then there's really nobody in the medical community and very few people other than organisations like ORDI who can really provide any kind of knowledge that can really help patients and families to manage this condition. And so, as I mentioned, that makes it extremely challenging to be a rare disease patient. And it also makes it extremely challenging to be able to find rare disease patients in order to be able to test new medications. But why is this important, not just to rare disease patients, but to wider society? And I think it's important because there are more than 7,000 rare diseases. Actually, the prevalence of rare disease is similar overall to the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in the US. And the more we find out about rare diseases in other countries, prevalence levels can become similar too. And so the cost overall to the healthcare systems of having chronic debilitating long-term conditions go undiagnosed as the disease progresses, and then having obviously increased morbidity and mortality is huge. And really combined with the advent of the fact that approximately 80% of these rare diseases are thought to be genetic in origin. So with increased sequencing and increase of targeted therapies to specific gene mutations, there is the potential to intervene in these diseases earlier and to potentially find treatments that could lower the cost overall to the healthcare system. I think it's also worth noting, how much of an impact pediatric rare diseases have on pediatric populations, and just what a huge impact that can be on infant mortality as well. So again, diseases that with today's technology could be reversible. I move on to the next slide. So regulators are well aware of the overall cost to society in terms of rare disease, but it still makes it very challenging because of those low patient numbers in each individual indication to incentivize drug development companies to create programs to find new treatments for each individual rare disease. And so different regulatory authorities globally have put different incentive packages in place in order to enhance rare disease drug development. And these really form a combination of tax relief, of reduction in regulatory fees, perhaps giving fast track or priority review to submissions. And then key is the market exclusivity. So the amount of time that the company developing the drug can receive revenue for that drug if they get approval. And obviously this is key to make pharmaceutical and biotech companies even consider looking at a rare disease indication. Now, I'm by no means the expert in global regulatory pathways and submissions. My colleague in the Pediatric and Rare Disease Centre of Excellence, Oksana Ilyach, is absolutely my go-to for all things regulatory. But we also have Shweta Pradhan, who's the head of our clinical operations in India, who has very kindly joined the call today and will answer specific questions about India. Getting a little bit of feedback. Wonderful, thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how it's not just regulatory incentives to develop rare disease compounds in terms of reviews and market exclusivity, but also to look at how the actual pathway, how the submission package will look different between a more prevalent indication and an ultra-rare disease. And I've given that ultra-rare disease is really the opposite end of the spectrum from the typical prevalent indications that we're used to. For those diseases that are 4, 5, 6 out of 10,000 individuals, the regulatory pathway will look potentially closer to that of a prevalent indication, or at least fall somewhere in between the two. But I've tried to show really what the kind of minimal development pathway in an ultra-rare disease, or the typical pathway, would be. So I think key for ultra-rare diseases is that we don't understand enough about the impact of the disease on the patient a lot of the time, and therefore it's very difficult to ascertain how to tell that a new intervention is really truly having an impact on that disease. And so a lot of development programs in ultra-rare disease will now start with a natural history study. This is a non-interventional study that follows patients for a number of years to determine what the most clinically meaningful things about their disease are, and what a drug should seek to improve in terms of what's impacting them most with their disease progression. And so where very little is known about the disease, a natural history study is becoming very much the industry standard and asked for by regulators where there's no additional information available. That can then overlap or quickly be followed by typically a phase 1/2 patient, phase 1/2 study in patients. Often we don't see the use of healthy volunteers for dose escalation studies in rare disease. So dose escalation will be done in patients, followed by an expansion phase, all within the same study. And based on this data, and if there are any kind of real world data sources that are available to show what would be happening in the patient population without a treatment, certainly the natural history study can also tell us that. All of this data can then be used in many territories to gain regulatory approval and market access. On the commitment, of course, that there is stringent phase 4 commitment to continue looking at the impact of the drug, particularly looking at additional secondary endpoints around quality of life or impact of the drug, and then looking at subset data, comorbidities, etc. And so now I want to dive into how we actually run these clinical trial programs. And first and foremost, we absolutely need to think about the patient and the family whenever we're thinking about how to run a rare disease clinical research. So they often know more than most medical professionals about not just, the day-to-day living with their condition, but also the science and clinical factors around their condition as well. And often they know as much as the specialists who are treating them. They're incredibly important stakeholders in any drug development process in rare disease. And, there aren't that many patients that a company has to engage with. Beyond the development pathway and into the commercial post-launch space. And so engaging them and finding what works for patients, not just in the context of the clinical trial, but also for any commercial and launch planning is really key, because there are so few patients, and making sure that things work for them is really, really important. So I wanted to give an example of where the patient and family perspective can really change clinical development programs. And this is an example of a rare disease, PFIC, where it's a liver condition. And so quite rightly, or quite understandably, in this development program, the physicians proposed an endpoint of serum bile acid responder rate, which is physiological endpoint. It's quantitative, it can be measured over time, and the impact of the drug on that can be measured. However, FDA had been conducting some listening sessions, and we're very clear that actually, is that the thing that is going to determine whether this drug can really help improve patient and family lives? And encouraged very much the company, and this was a program that we worked on with them, to develop an endpoint that actually reflected the concerns of the patient and the family. And when all of those interviews were conducted to listen much more to what was happening to the patients who were impacted by this disease, the itching that these patients experienced was completely unmanageable. It was causing significant distress, lack of sleep, very high pain to a lot of the patients who suffered this condition. As a consequence, was also, having an impact on their mental health, the mental health of the family, their ability to function in other areas, because this itching would just require so much treatment and then prevent the patient from sleeping, and that patient would be in pain for much of the night. And so now that endpoint has been changed from that physiological endpoint of serum bile acid responder rate to working with patients and families and sites to determine how that itching can be used as an endpoint to really determine whether a drug is having an impact in PFIC or not. And so when we start, once we have the protocol started, or the protocol agreed, then looking for countries and sites to run rare disease studies in becomes very important. And unlike larger indications, prior experience is actually much less important. There may be no prior experience anywhere globally. And these patients are so hard to find. And so teams who are working on rare disease protocols are absolutely always turning every stone possible to try and find the best chance of success for recruiting and completing a program to get that treatment tested more quickly and brought to patients more quickly. So where we can find patient advocacy groups, where we can find pre-existing registries, and where we can find specialists who are seeing those patients and are well connected with patient communities, those are all factors that will hugely determine whether a country or site is selected for a rare disease program. And once we have those relevant endpoints and the countries and sites selected, we still need to look and understand whether the study is achievable for patients to participate in. And this really involves walking through every single study assessment and figuring out how to limit barriers to participation for patients and families at each and every site visit. And this may be through providing travel concierge services, reimbursing travel, accommodation, meals. It may be by providing particular medical educational support, e-consent tools to ensure that patients really understand what study participation involves. It may involve working with patient advocacy groups to raise study awareness and perhaps facilitate some of the things that would allow patients to participate. But we also work very closely with sites, and clinical research centres are so great at understanding the patient pathway and the impact of the disease on the families, and really thinking outside of the box in terms of how to help patients to participate in clinical research by, organising around around their lives to ensure that they are able to participate. And part of my role is absolutely to think about that. So how, once we've got all these things in place, how do we engage patients and families to participate in a study? And sometimes people will ask me to come up with a strategy to recruit patients for this study. And I always try to explain that if there are 12 patients in this study, there's probably going to be 12 different approaches that are needed to recruit and fulfill recruitment into that study. And it really does come down to understanding the potential patient pathway for each and every individual patient in order to be able to encourage them to participate in the study, should they be willing to. Now, I can't believe I've made it this far into a presentation without mentioning COVID. It might not be 2020 anymore, but I did want to mention that the impact of COVID-19, because obviously it's extremely important. And there has been a huge impact on rare disease clinical research globally. Obviously, not only are patients not really able to access sites in the same way, but physicians and site staff have been out sick, have been overburdened, or also not being allowed to access or have patients access study sites. And our monitors who check all of the data to check that it's possible to submit it for filing, they haven't been able to access hospitals either. That all to say, this slide here shows a quantitative analysis of what happened to the rare disease studies that are in IQVIA's portfolio that we're running on behalf of sponsor and biotech companies. Not everything went on hold, and I'll share some case studies in a moment of how studies have been able to continue during COVID-19. The majority of studies that have been impacted by COVID-19 are absolutely those that are seeking to enroll new patients, and we're hoping that we'll see some resurgence in recruiting patients into new studies as things start to open up in certain parts of the world again. But there are a lot of activities where possible that have been moved to a virtual setting. So any kind of startup, regulatory, ethics committee submissions, even training has been able to be moved into a virtual setting, really reducing that number of people who are bringing transmission infection risk into our clinical trial sites. And then there's been a lot of adaptation to ensure that data can be checked. And this really has been hospitals and other research centres that have been really willing to allow us to look electronically at their data sources, where previously perhaps somebody might have been going into the centre to visit that hospital. So when we look at what could actually be done to keep a study going during COVID-19. So this is a case study from a rare respiratory condition. And this is a condition where many of the patients are used to isolating anyway during cooler seasons. And so the advice around COVID was absolutely that these patients be deep in isolation and not interacting with anybody else, certainly not visiting clinical trial sites. But in order to preserve all of the data that had already been collected in this study, which was a tremendous amount, and to ensure that the patient's commitment to the study still meant something, the whole study really had to be moved, taken out of the hospital setting and brought into the patient home if it was going to continue. And this did happen. The whole team sat down, looked at the protocol, removed absolutely everything that was nice to have rather than critical to have. Some of the endpoints were moved from a physician-assessed clinic setting to a patient-assessed electronic diary. So patients were actually more responsible for assessing their own endpoints and reporting on them. The study drug was delivered by courier directly to individual homes, and where lab assessments were still necessary, highly trained home health care could be deployed to the home to take those lab assessments, collect them and have them tested. And then patients were still able to see the specialist through remote telehealth visits. And so this is an example of where a study really can be converted to be in a patient home. It took COVID-19 to make this happen overall to the entire study, but many of these elements we had already been doing, particularly in rare disease across different programs. And it's promising that there are ways that we can continue rare disease research really in the face of anything. I wanted to share another case study. This is from a study in a rare inborn error of metabolism. This is a gene therapy study, and, you know, for a really kind of life-limiting condition. So the unmet need is huge. And right at the height of COVID-19 in Spain, there were national lockdowns, regional lockdowns in place. Children weren't even allowed to leave the home. But a baby was identified in one part of Spain that was separate from our hospital site. But that physician identified that there was this study ongoing in a completely different part of Spain and worked with the clinical trial site, with the sponsor and with our team to get all of the hospital and government approvals to allow this child to travel with their family to the clinical trial site and be a part in this study that could, you know, potentially be a life-saving treatment for this patient. And so this was very much the exception rather than the rule, but highlights, you know, where an unmet need is so high for patients that hopefully continuing to find new treatments and hopefully sites and physicians really pushing to find new treatment options for their patients as well can result in continuing research and continuing new treatments. And so this is my last slide. And I really just wanted to say, you know, that COVID-19 has absolutely been hugely disruptive to rare disease clinical research, which was already extremely challenging to conduct. But hopefully there may actually be some positive disruption that results from this pandemic, particularly in two key areas. And I think if we can bring that flexibility in study design to bring each patient into the study, or bring the study to each patient, if it's in their home, if it's at alternative sites, if it's by doing the study in a slightly different way, I think that will be key to continuing research in the future and really a positive change. And then the second part is if we can simplify protocols, if we can remove unnecessary assessments for that registrational portion and move some of those assessments into the phase 4 setting, that has the benefit of making clinical research in rare disease quicker, less burdensome to the patient and cheaper. And you would hope, therefore, that there would be more treatments being able to be tested in rare disease indications, all with the goal of obviously bringing more treatment options to rare disease patients and families. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Smyth, for such a wonderful presentation. And it was such a lucid and wonderful presentation. I'm very sure that everybody hearing had a very clear idea about how to initiate a clinical research, the challenges faced, and what exactly is happening at this moment. We do have a few questions for you here. The first question is by Ms. Sudha Bhattacharya. And here she asks that, can you suggest funding sources about initiating natural history study for an ultra rare disorder?
Yes, yeah, so absolutely. And it's great that you've got some interest in this, because I think, as we've seen, one of the impacts of COVID-19 is absolutely that there's less funding sometimes for things like natural history studies to get started. A lot of this funding will come from patient advocacy groups or from local community support. So that's absolutely, I guess, the majority of the physicians that we work with, or patient advocacy groups who have initiated a natural history study, have found that funding from the local community that they're in, or from research grants, either from their local academic institution, from regional, or for national research bodies. One thing I will say is that a natural history study that could interest potentially a pharma or biotech company in participating in a program, that can fall on a spectrum. So a very robust natural history study with the intent of being used in a registrational program, that's an expensive study to run, and funding for those kind of programs absolutely will have to come through some kind of grant, either at a national or a local level. But sorry.
No, please continue. Please continue.
But simply having a registry of patients, it doesn't necessarily need to be completely complex, but knowing where patients are in your country or in your region who are impacted by this ultra rare disease, having some information about them can also be sufficient to start discussing, particularly with different gene therapy targeted companies, for example, how to start clinical development in that program. So it really depends on what your aims are as to where funding might come from. But I don't think that in order to solve or to find a treatment for a condition, that it has to be a completely robust and expensive natural history study. There's still a lot of value in generating just an understanding of where patients are if funding isn't available.
Thank you for the answer. I have another question. From another member of our rare disease community, which actually says that, see, for many disorders, like we have seen that there is incomplete understanding of the natural history itself, and for many disorders there's a spectrum of phenotypes that we are observing, and in such a case, what would be your suggestion to alternatives of randomized clinical trials? This is especially true in a country like India, because we do see a lot of spectrum in one particular disorder itself. And it might not be that the diagnosis in all the places of like the whole history taking in all the places are uniform. Like most of the physicians will not take a history very uniformly. There's no standard of taking these kind of histories. So how do you think should be the alternatives to randomized clinical trials in these cases?
Yeah, and there's a couple of options. It's a great question. So one option is absolutely to initiate a natural history study prior to the intervention. So having longitudinal data in one patient, so following them for a time before introducing the intervention, then assessing the impact of the intervention at some point during the study, which really allows you to have, for that patient essentially to serve as their own control arm. So that's one option. And in the course of the natural history study, those the best endpoints can be determined. Now, that's obviously an option that would need to be followed likely by some kind of other interventional program. But another option are protocols that I've seen where their manifestation can be very different based on the clinical phenotype, can obviously be either you can use the physiological endpoints like we described, so you can use biomarkers, or you can measure enzyme activity if, for example, it's an enzyme that's been impacted. So that's absolutely an option too. Or I have seen protocols where you can have different endpoints based on the clinical phenotype of the disease in an individual patient. So you can have within the same protocol alternative primary and secondary endpoints that are determined at screening based on the patient presentation, which is the most clinically relevant endpoint for that patient.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful answer. Queries probably which we have. The second question which we have over here is that after a rare disease, it's by Mr. Pradipta Verma, and he asks that after a rare disease drug has been approved, are there any market access challenges faced by pharmaceutical companies, as many developed companies depend on health insurance for funding?
Yeah, and I can't speak specifically to India, so Shweta or yourself, Dr. Datta, might be better placed to comment specifically on India. There are absolutely market access challenges. I guess one of the things that we talk about in rare disease, that prevalence, so that 4, 5, or 6 out of 10,000 being the limit for what determines an orphan drug, also means that the cost to the healthcare system is much lower. There are far fewer patients, and so there's less barriers to reimbursement than perhaps you might see for a much more prevalent indication, because the cost of that drug does not need to be multiplied by the hundreds of thousands or by the millions. It's more likely for a handful of patients in any one country, and I think that's really important. Secondly, I think what market access authorities will look at, and then the HTA assessment, is what the impact on the quality of life to the patient is, and what the overall cost of disease progression may be to the patient. And again, actually, this may help in terms of securing natural history funding sometimes as well, making that argument of understanding, what the impact on mortality is, but also what the cost of things like care when there's developmental or cognitive decline, when there's neuromuscular decline. Patients need to have lots of different treatments. They need to have intensive care, and they also need to have lots of other support in terms of their quality of life and support from other care providers. And so I think where that argument can be made very robustly, it's always clear that rare disease drugs overall typically will cost society less by helping in some way to modify or at least slow that disease progression and delay the need for other interventions at an earlier stage. But that's not to say there are obviously still huge barriers with sometimes accessing reimbursement, and I'll leave Shweta and Dr. Datta to specifically on India.
In India at present, probably a lot of clinical trials running which are indigenous to even comment on it. I would rather here ask another question, which is another question which is from our community, which see, when we are talking about such programs, often we see that there are global trials. And from India, we would like to participate in such global clinical research, but then we don't. Though we have the number of patients for many rare disorders are high over here, but still the approach for these kind of clinical research trials by pharmaceutical companies are not that encouraging. Though we have patient support groups, we have our Organization of Rare Disease of India, who sort of where we are projecting or we are trying to build such kind of relationship. But what would be your advice as to in future how can we make this something where even India or the Indian rare disease community can also be a part of such global research trials so that even our patients get a fair chance?
Absolutely. And yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit in one of my slides, but really to expand, rare disease clinical studies are very challenging to find patients and to find motivated sites. And that really make the difference between whether your study can recruit in a reasonable time frame or not, which is really important. And so I understand everybody is already doing so much work to advocate and try and bring rare disease research to India. It's actually a conversation that we have a lot with sponsors as well, in terms of wanting to bring rare disease research to India. But I think typically, because of the way that the global regulatory filing works, the sponsors will typically have to look at including the US and Europe. And so beyond that, then you start to consider the countries where that you have these patients and sites. And so I guess my advice would be, wherever possible, that there's as much information about the patient group and about the physician's interest in that indication as possible in the public domain, through presentations at global congress, through literature, publications in the literature, even having a significant profile perhaps on Google or Facebook, so that, certainly I go on Facebook when we're looking to figure out what countries and sites to use for ultra rare diseases, because there's so much information on there. So just increasing visibility of information sources, and then collecting very rudimentary registries is incredibly helpful for bringing clinical research to your country, and then proactively approaching sponsors who are developing, so pharmaceutical or biotech companies who are developing drugs in that indication, by email and saying, I have this registry, who want to participate. Yeah. I want to participate. And I think certainly that makes a huge difference and will hugely increase the chances of clinical research being brought to India.
Absolutely well said, Ali. I think, Dr. Datta, that's been our major challenge when we kind of, go for asking for more clinical trials for India in the rare disease area. Just because we don't have well-structured data around what's the prevalence, or, do we have the patients of this indication, it becomes very challenging to convince people to come in. The regulatory situation here today is much, much improved. If we see, we are as good as what US approval timelines, etc. are. So I think our effort should be to create that database of patients and, highlight it to relevant stakeholders to bring it in.
So I believe that we need a registry which is much more planned. We also need the visibility so that we are accessible to such disorders. So we have another question. Yeah, so we have other questions to Dr. Smyth. Is that how can compassionate use policy be used to assess drugs that are still in phase 3 trial?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if the answering the question, if you're referring to the patients who are in the phase 3 trial, or if you're referring to other patients who are not a part of the phase 3.
Other patients, I guess the other patients who are not in the phase 3 trials.
Yeah, and I suppose that in this instance, if there is sufficient data in place, I think this is the challenge, because if you're going to have a phase 3 study, obviously you're looking for that expanded safety and efficacy data in that bigger cohort, right? So this already is probably not, an ultra rare disease that we don't know a lot about. So often where you have a phase 3, there is some data available, there's possibly some treatment available, and that's where I think regulators may get a little bit more nervous about approving access to treatment for a patient that has never had that drug within the setting of a clinical study. And so, I would advocate, rather than necessarily bringing those compassionate use programs and creating kind of like additional, although they're often obviously already there for patients who are participating in the study, but I would advocate more for shortening that timeline to regulatory approval and increasing that phase 4 commitment as the focus for where we should be. So i.e. trying to get treatments more quickly to patients that have been approved by regulators, rather than kind of focusing a lot of effort on providing treatments to patients who fall within that category. But nonetheless, I understand, like, it is a big unmet need. It's incredibly frustrating for patients and families if they haven't been able to access that primary clinical trial. I can just understand why there's some reluctance to prescribe those treatments in cases other than where the unmet need is extremely high and, the disease could have an impact on mortality within the time frame of approval. So yeah, it's a situation.
Yeah, and also, just for everybody's reference, we do have, expeditious regulatory pathways, or rather orphan drugs are fast-tracked in terms of giving marketing approvals. So if you have good data from, say, a US or Europe for a particular drug, where we have good prevalence in the country, that can be submitted and it's considered, and they do give a to market it and then have phase 4 data generated on safety, like what Dr. Smyth alluded to. So we do have that pathway. So that can be a way if there is a good treatment available. But phase 3 becomes a little challenging because you're still testing the drug and it's not really a proven treatment as such.
Correct. And we do have examples of such drugs which are being used currently in as a compassionate access program. That's something which I have. There are families who are hearing it. It is for a certain duration. So I guess we need to also plan what happens after that certain duration of the compassionate access program. Like, it is for 6 years or 7 years. Then what happens after that 6 years and 7 years? Will that patient stop getting that treatment, or the treatment will continue? And what is the cost implications for that family? So all these also need to be discussed, because it's just not about a short span. When we're talking about rare disease, it's about it's a long-term plan. With this only, because we are talking about a lot of visibility and data, what do you think? This is a question to both Dr. Smyth and Dr. Shweta as well. What do you think about the data safety of which say for example, a parent support group or an organization like Organization of Rare Disease India might need to look at, because if we are looking at data and we are looking at visibility, what about the data safety, and what needs to be sort of followed, so that the data is also safe with the parent support group and not misused?
So, Dr. Datta, I can take the first jab at it, and Ali, you may add that there, from your experience. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So, in terms of keeping the data safe, I believe you're talking about the data safety. I think that should reside with patient support groups like you, right? And you need to, if anybody needs access to the data, I think there is more for you to give anonymized access to it, rather than providing them, or you have to have all the data privacy norms kept in mind when you're collecting and distributing that data. I would say it's very, very important for us to today have a registry at your end within the patient support group, around the different type of rare diseases that are there in India and what's the prevalence like. The groups like yours can definitely do that, but for us, I think we need more access to understanding whether in India these kind of patients do exist, what's the number, etc. Like we don't really need to know the name and address of the patient, right? And all that you need to do is direct them to the right PI or the investigator who will be doing the clinical trial, which we can bring to you. I think there needs to be that collaboration between the patient support groups and the organizations doing research in this area to take this further. In my view, that's the way you can sort of hold on to the privacy of the patients, etc. Patients are only accessible to the investigators. You should not sort of divulge that information to any of the research organizations like us.
So basically, anonymizing the data is one way, and
Right.
keeping the rights of the data with the support groups and the primary investigator is basically what we are looking at over here.
Yeah.
Dr. Shweta and also Dr. Ali can also add probably. What about, India has brilliant scientific institutes. India has brilliant doctors who are diagnosing. But we still lack in like clinical trials or orphan drug trials. Uh, do you think it is because there is some problem with the coordination of a parent support group and the labs, the PI, the scientific labs and the doctors over here? So is it because of that, or like you feel that we are lacking behind of developing our own orphan drugs? Because we do have a lot of rare disease patients in India.
I would say we don't have a lot of intellect, we have a lot of scientific expertise, but I guess there are so many patients that there is no time with the researchers or the investigators who have to do this research. Many investigators I've seen, they do it in their ambit, they do have data within their spheres, but when it comes to sharing, when it comes to people coming together, they don't find the right platform to gather all the data together. I think it's just about educating some of them to see how we can collaborate together and take it forward, and I would agree that India has been behind in this aspect because we've not had good platforms to gather all the data at one place, so that's something which is happening now, but I would say it will take some years for us to get there.
Dr. Ali, we do have some like a bit different questions for you. I don't know whether if you want to answer them. If you don't, you can say you don't want to answer. But there are a few specific questions on how to find a clinical trial. And they are asking for specific trials for cystic fibrosis and DMD.
Sure. So, I mean, how to find clinical trials globally? Typically, sponsors will have to register on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And so that would be, my first port of call to understand if there were research programs ongoing in a particular indication, or understand the companies that are running studies in those indications. Now, depending on how rare the disease, and cystic fibrosis is an example where it isn't hugely rare, so this may be less likely to happen unless it's a specific mutation of interest for a study. But, some clinical trial sites, some sponsors will entertain cross-border referrals. And so if you have a patient that you believe could benefit from a treatment, contacting, obviously in light of COVID-19, this can be more tricky with international travel, but there are options for patients to go to other countries to access treatment. And for inborn errors of metabolism, that I can see somebody asking on the chat window, that's absolutely an area where it can be really challenging to find the patients in the right time frame prior to that recruitment, that study being recruited in time. So it would be an option, as well as to look internationally, to talk internationally to investigators. And also to potentially contact the company and ask if India can be part of the clinical trial. When studies are failing to recruit, we have to look for new countries. And again, if you can bring data sources that show that you have available patients within that country, it's a real possibility that a study can be brought to that country. Obviously, protecting patient privacy, although on that I will say that the ORDI survey last year among European patients found that data privacy concerns were really of very little importance to families impacted by rare disease, really because of such a high need. These communities tend to advocate much for data sharing, right? And as somebody who's impacted by rare disease in my own family, that's very much my approach as well. I'm very much more willing to share data in the hope that it has an overall benefit for that indication. So it's slightly different. So that would be my suggestion. Specifically on inborn errors of metabolism, I can see there's a question about liver transplant. I'm not a physician. This obviously is a treatment option, but I do think some of the gene therapies and targeted therapies possibly represent a slightly better therapeutic option where they're available for these patients. But clearly lots of patients with inborn errors of metabolism have managed to thrive following a liver transplant. So it does represent absolutely a different treatment option.
Thank you so much for answering. And yes, I also wanted to highlight that liver transplant option. In more areas of metabolism, we can do liver transplant, and here we do have some support from the government also for these kind of transplants. We do have crowdfunding platforms for these kind of transplants, where Organization of Rare Disease India has been very active in such cases. But also at the same time, I would want to point out that the timing of this liver transplant has to be correct. So for that, the diagnosis has to be pretty early. And also this also sort of is very relevant to the point that there are few markers for whether that particular child can undergo a liver transplant or not. So it has to be before that particular onset, before it's damaging the brain, or before it's whether the MRI is clean at certain times. There are often neuropathy, whether those kind of onset has been happening will direct whether that liver transplant is supposed to happen or not. So here early diagnosis is also a criteria, though not relevant to what we are discussing at this point. But so the other thing which I would like to add, because many people are asking about finding clinical trials, in Organization of Rare Disease India, we do support you in finding such trials, and we do help you to connect with people outside and help you for the relevant trials. And as Dr. Smyth was saying, that sometimes we ourselves write to people so that to see whether it can be recruited or not, though COVID has sort of slowed us down. But I hope this is not a permanent situation. This is a temporary phase we are going through. We do not have any more questions, and I thank Dr. Ali Smyth for such a wonderful, lucid talk, and also for having so much patience for answering the questions so well. I also thank Dr. Shweta for answering the questions well, and it was a very fruitful discussions. At least for me, I do right now have a clearer point of view as to how we can bring clinical trials, how we can bring in patients, and I'm sure all the patient support group members who are hearing would have benefited from this discussion. With this, I would end this particular session thanking the speaker, Dr. Ali Smyth, Dr. Shweta, Organization of Rare Disease India, for sharing this platform, and all the participants who had joined us. Stay tuned with us for more on such discussions and more on even specific disease-specific discussions on this Care for Rare webinars. And with this, I thank everybody and end this session over. Thank you, Dr. Ali Smyth. Thank you, Dr. Shweta. Thank you, ORDI. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so
Pleasure
much.
to be here.
Thanks. Bye.
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 And a special thank you to all the participants who have joined us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Much.